Hey everyone, we're going to get going in about 30 seconds, but in the meantime, invite you to share in the music with us a little bit as we just admit the rest of the guests. Okay, I think we can start to get going. Thanks, Ashley, for being our resident DJ amongst everything else. So I wanted to say a warm welcome to everyone. Welcome to the Democracy Dialogues. I'm your host, Victoria Cuquetz. For those of you who have participated in past sessions, welcome back. And for anyone who's newly joining us, thanks so much for being here. John Beebe, Ashley, Denny Patch, and I have programmed an exciting episode for you that I hope you'll find timely, responsive, and engages those who are advancing democracy at all levels in Canada. And if you have an interesting idea or topic in mind, I invite you to write to us and share. So I'm excited to be with all of you and host this conversation. I'm hoping that you'll actively participate during our question and answer period and during our polls, and I look forward to your questions and comments in our chat box. But first, before we get going, I'm hoping that all of you will introduce yourselves to me and to one another. So please use the chat function to share your names and which organizations you're joining us from today. So we're all here to discuss the necessity of local news and its impact on democracy. At heart, we know that journalism is a public good and a mechanism for truth, and that democracy relies on truth as a foundational and necessary condition for it to thrive. We know that democracy thrives when the public is engaged and well-informed, and that requires a vibrant and a healthy press. So in this session, we'll be exploring one of the most critical challenges to journalism in our democracy, which is the decline in local news. According to the Local News Project right here at Ryerson University, 451 news operations have closed since the project started tracking data in 2008, and only 184 local news outlets have launched since. I'm not amazing at math, keep it in mind, but you don't need to be amazing at math to grasp the overwhelming loss to Canadian news. So today we'll deep dive into the connection between democracy and its reliance on local journalism and building and maintaining civic society and a shared understanding at the grassroots level. So before we get going though, I'd like to introduce a quick poll question that Ashley's going to help us out with. So the question I'd love to pose to all of you is there a local newspaper in your home community? Feel free to answer yes or no. Okay, so far we're seeing 90% of people say yes, so that's quite encouraging. And only about 6% say no. Okay, so bearing in mind we have some answers to share, would you mind sharing in the chat box what's it called? And in the event that there isn't one, are you aware of one that used to be in existence? Please feel free to share. So in a moment, we're going to introduce our incredible lineup of guests, but first I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. So today we're meeting virtually, so you may not be on the same ground as me. I'm currently in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and Mississaugas of the New Credit Territory. So instead, please join me in acknowledging the Indigenous people of all the lands we're on today to reflect on the importance of those lands. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving relationships between nations and to collaborating in the spirit of reconciliation. As a first-generation Canadian myself, my parents come from Australia, which is another white settler colony, and the former colonized India and Trinidad and Tobago. So my commitment to an equitable future is deeply felt and in solidarity with respect to my own maternal ancestors having been indentured laborers. To continue my learning and put my observances into action, I recently turned into Public Policy Forum speaker series on Indigenous issues, the most recent of which was on Indigenous data sovereignty. So if you have events or learnings you're taking part in to deepen your knowledge and solidarity with Indigenous people, then please share in the chat as well so that we can share it with one another. I'd also like to say a quick word about the invasion of Ukraine and its connection to the conversation today. Warfare operates on many levels, from the devastating physical manifestations and loss of human life, but it also operates in terms of information disorder. Local news and amazingly courageous journalists are fighting a war on many levels and are working tirelessly to report on the truth as it unfolds, right as we see Russia silence its own independent news media. So I'd like us all to take a moment of silence, maybe about 15 seconds, to express our own solidarity and resounding commitment to democracy and to independent journalism worldwide. So please take a moment with me. And while that certainly isn't long enough, thank you for sharing in that with me and keeping it in your thoughts. So I'm not going to make you wait for our amazing panel anymore. So I'd like to offer a warm welcome to our guests, Jessica Johnson, editor-in-chief of the Walrus magazine, and Karen Pugliese, who is the managing editor of CBC Investigative, both influential journalists who are leading efforts in this current climate. We're also joined by Katie Davey, editor of PPF Media and the co-author of the newly released report, Shattered Mirror, 5 Years On. So a warm welcome to our guests today. I'd also like to thank them for exemplifying the International Women's Day theme of Women Inspiring Women. I'm so inspired and so pleased to have you with us to share your expertise and leadership. Thanks for being here. How are all of you doing?
Well, thank you.
Well enough.
Yeah. I think that's a very honest answer. And Katie, how are you doing?
Yeah, well enough. I mentioned to folks that my internet's not great today, so just apologies in advance if something does go wrong on my side.
Okay, don't worry, we'll navigate around that. So I think, we can jump right into the conversation. So Jessica, I'd love to start with you. From your perspective, can you please tell us, your thoughts on the relationship between local journalism and democracy?
Yeah, I think from the media's perspective, we can't cover society's most important issues if we're not here. So many journalism jobs have been lost in Canada over the last decade, and in particular since the pandemic started. My colleague Katie will probably be able to fill us in on some of the numbers, but local media is the grassroots coverage of city council meetings, elections, and what we've seen happening on a national level and to some degree in an international level is that trust in media is dropping and trust in government is dropping. So then you have to look at the rise of social offset by the decline of the number of journalists reporting in this country and look at what that does to the public mindset and just sort of how we're all doing. I think the convoy protests in Ottawa were a real demonstration of lack of faith in what people were being told. So that's the big picture. On a personal level, we believe that you need the media to continue a conversation in society, like give people a place to go, give them something to think about, let them contribute as well.
Thanks so much for that, Jessica. And I'd also like to ask you a little bit about your article on the future of journalism, which, we appreciated reading so much. So I'm just wondering if you can just give us a bit of insight into what prompted you to write it and the evolution of your thoughts since.
I was frustrated. Thank you. Yeah, I was frustrated by the narrative that the media is dying. It's very prevalent, and I think sort of dates to when Donald Trump took office in 2016 and started tweeting about the fake news media all the time. So there is a real concern in media, in government, in the public, in organizations like the one that we're all gathered around today about what's happening. But what I don't hear is a lot of the explanations why. And I thought, why don't we talk in a way that the public can understand about the real financial decisions that led to the point that we're at and maybe what their role might be in turning things around, and also to provide some solutions, because I don't think it's hopeless. There just has to be the will to value media and then give them a playing field where we can all survive.
I think that's really well said. Thank you so much for that. Katie, I think I'm going to turn over to you now. So we're obviously so thrilled that the timing of PPF's new report, The Shattered Mirror, 5 Years On, was just released in time for this conversation. So thanks for joining us. I'm wondering if you can, bearing in mind that it's a fulsome report, I'm wondering if you can give us a bit of a high-level picture of its aims and some of its findings. I know we'll dig into that some more during this conversation as well, but just really wanted to hand the floor over to you to give a sense of, the 5 years on piece of it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Victoria. It's a pleasure to be here. And I did co-author the report with 3 other fantastic folks in this space, including Ed Greenspan, the CEO of Public Policy Forum, who was instrumental in the Shattered Mirror 5 years ago, not the Shattered Mirror, and the Shattered Mirror 5 years on, rather. To Jessica's point, over the last 10 or so years, community newspapers specifically have seen an advertising revenue decline from 1.2 billion in 2011 to 400 million in 2020. That's over a 100% reduction. And that's important because advertising revenue is a key way that we pay journalists. That's a big part of this, right? We have to be able to compensate and pay for journalists. And so this is a really key thing that's at the foundation of one of these issues. And, at the same period, almost 300 papers either disappeared or merged with other publications. So what we were looking at specifically in this 5-year on report was kind of 3 things: platforms, innovation, and local news. So it had 2 key questions. One was, how do we build on the success of the local journalism initiative, which was introduced about 3 years ago by the federal government, and in just 2022 employed over 300 journalists in Canada and local communities. So we entered the conversation with, how do we build on this success, and how do we more institutionalize the actual hiring and frankly funding of local journalism? At the same time, there's a growing conversation in Canada right now, and globally, frankly, around something called the Australian model. And it's called that because Australia was the first country to introduce it. And what that is basically a negotiated funding agreement between big tech, so right now mostly Meta, which is formerly Facebook, and Google, to fund newspaper and journalist organizations that are providing a key service. So the federal government has signaled that Canada is going to adopt this so-called Australia model. And so what we sought to do in that part of the paper is say, okay, we hear you, you're going to do it. How do we do it better? And so the better piece here for us in a major way was transparency. So right now in the Australia model in Australia, it doesn't, agreements are not transparent. The public doesn't know what these big tech organizations are contributing to journalism. And we think, foundationally, in the same way that we don't want government to influence journalism, we don't want big tech to influence journalism. And so transparency is really a key piece of that. So again, 2 very, very big topics. We think there is an interrelation because with the introduction of the so-called Australia model, we anticipate the larger publications particularly will benefit more. We think small will still benefit, but we see a real opportunity for the expanded local journalism initiative to help bridge that gap and to help really make sure that local community journalism is supported. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much, Katie. I think that gives a really nice window into it. And then we certainly invite all of our guests to read the report and reflect on it some more as well. Karen, so really excited to hear from you now. So I'm just wondering, bearing in mind the data that we shared earlier from the local news project and what Katie's just shared as well, I'm just wondering, if you can meditate a little bit on what are some of the risks and impacts of these closures of local newsrooms and of news deserts more broadly? And, have you observed civic discourse changing as a result?
Well, I mean, we had a really good example at exactly the time that local news was getting sucker punched by the pandemic, right? Because they were already losing revenue to Google, to Facebook through the advertising. And then one of the things that was kind of helpful for local media is that there's still like Bob's Trucks around the corner that might want to advertise in the family newspaper or the local newspaper, but suddenly everything was just being shut down. And so a lot of the advertising stopped, and that was like a second hit. It was like being kicked when you were down. I guess there's a wonderful opportunity ahead of us because the entry level for online media is so low now because you can go online, you don't have the production costs. But at the same time, we've lost the revenue sources. And I think, to Katie's point, those revenue sources need to be diverse. So have I seen the discourse change where there's news deserts? Well, I think there have always been places in Canada where there are news deserts. And to the point, I guess, I was trying to make is we saw at that same moment of the pandemic just how important local media was. If you needed to know what was shut down, if you needed to know how many people in your community were sick, if you needed to know which hospital was full or where to go for services, what might be open, what might be closed, where you could grocery shop, This was all really dependent on local media because it just wasn't something that a national newsroom could fit. I think the other danger in shutting down and shutting out local media, I mean, some things were mentioned already, and we could talk about them more: elections, accountability to of local councils, but also of your local MP who serves you federally. These are all very important. But where you can really lose is that national media and regional media want to play to a general audience, like what is generally out there that is going to serve people. And they miss a lot of the minor issues that might be strongly important, but only to a small number of like 200 people in an area. So those are the things that where we really start to miss the service.
Thanks so much for that. I appreciate it. And so I think just to continue to press on that a little bit, I also want to talk about the role that local news plays in combating information disorder. Jessica, can you weigh in on that a little bit, please?
Well, at the Walrus, we believe really heavily in fact-checking. And so we're in a time right now when people can go out and find their own facts. Like they can be like, this is what supports my worldview, therefore I agree with it and I don't. We believe in being very transparent about how we do our research. If we make a mistake, we issue a transparent correction. And what I'm hoping for is for audiences to understand the Walrus may not get every single fact right in its entire life. And in fact, we don't. But if we make a mistake, you can trust us to admit it and share our work with you so that you see what our reporting method is. I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but I think that's one way of going about it.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you. And I'm also interested to hear about, the Walrus's leadership and participation in the Trust Project and, anything else that you're all working on to proactively inform and work against, disinformation and misinformation as well. Thanks.
Yeah, so we're living in a time when the media is a really huge playing field, and I like that. I have friends that have Substacks that release newsletters every week and then collect revenue directly from readers. And we have, big institutions like the New York Times. I hope this conversation comes back to them eventually at some point in this conversation. But so the Trust Project is a consortium of international news organizations, and it is committed to truth and accuracy. Not everyone can belong to the Trust Project. You have to do quite a bit of work in order to qualify. Some big Canadian media outlets do. The CBC was one of the founding members, I think. And so what you have to do to belong is to sort of share your purpose and say, this is our editorial mission, this is what we're trying to do. And if you go to any story on our webpage, it'll have a little Trust Project widget, and it'll also have a bio for the person who wrote it. So maybe you're skeptical about our article on vaccines. You can see who that person is that wrote it. You can cross-reference with their other work. Maybe it will inform your understanding of where they were coming from. And that's all with a view to putting out work that audiences know the person had the right intentions in publishing it, if that makes any sense.
Oh, that's
so
very
our donations
helpful.
went way up when we joined the Trust Project.
Congratulations, that's excellent. Karen, I'd love to hear a little bit from you on that as well, given that CBC was also a founding member of it. Thank you.
Well, I think, CBC obviously does local news and serves local communities. I guess, my feeling about it is that while I have faith that CBC does a good job and fulfills that mandate, that there still has to be diversity. And not just diversity in the CBC newsroom, but diversity, like a best media ecosystem works where there is both public and private. And that's something I think that probably Public Policy Forum would agree with me on, because I read the report. And I think that it was kind of confirmed by the thinking of the report. When we're talking about news deserts, I also was just thinking of my own community of Pikwakanagan. It is a news desert. There is no news service in that community. It is settling or attempting to settle a land claim right now. And the land claim impacts 6 other Algonquin communities, and they have no way of communicating with each other. So there's rumors and everything spreads on Facebook, and there's all these groups, and something happens and everything explodes. But then you take a look at the Mohawk communities, and there's 4 of them along the southern border. They have a radio station. They have more than one news service so that you can check one news service online, and if they have a certain bent to it, you can check another news service online. And so, like, just you can really see how misinformation, not even disinformation, but misinformation can spread when there's news desert and people just aren't sure and are very concerned about something that they have high stakes in.
Thank you for that, Karen. And so we actually did our last democracy dialogue on the Canadian Commission for Democratic Expression and some of the work that PPF is doing on misinformation and disinformation. But Katie, did you want to weigh in on anything there just to kind of round out the question?
Yeah, well, I'd be happy to speak a bit to that as well. But, what Karen just said really sparked with me because, a quote I'll actually point to in the report is, "A community without a way to inform itself about itself is just a population of unempathetic strangers." And that wasn't my writing, that was Chris Dornan's work. But, I think it's just so important because, again, we've talked a lot already here about how there's a national landscape, but without the local landscape, not only do you not find out what your municipal ward councillor is doing or what's happening at City Hall or your local court, but you also don't get to share with each other the key and core issues that you're facing. And at your dinner table, you're not talking about what's going on with the local road, which I can say, look, I'm from New Brunswick, so these are issues that we have faced, right? Instead, we're talking about what's happening kind of in either the national landscape or frankly, in Halifax, because that's how the kind of coverage has pivoted. So, I think to Karen's point, that diverse representation is also incredibly important in the local context. On disinformation, misinformation, and online harms more broadly, Indeed Public Policy Forum really sees our democracy and good governance work as having two key components. One is around journalism policy, and the other is around addressing dis and misinformation. And so we're in year 2 of a 3-year project on that exact topic. And to your point, Victoria, we have the Commission on Democratic Expression that's looking specifically this year at disinformation, and their report will be released actually, hopefully by the end of the month, all things unfolding well. So they'll have a lot of really key recommendations. It is co-chaired by Taylor Owen and Beverly McLaughlin. So, I'll say stay tuned on that front because I'll be excited as well to hear what they have to say.
Thanks so much for that. So Karen, I'd love to go back to you for a moment just to talk a little bit about the convoy and CBC's coverage of it on the ground. So I'm just wondering, obviously, it's a very complex issue with lots of different sides, but I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about what you see as some of the key issues around distrust and lack of connection to traditional journalism. Do you think this is in part due to the decline of local news? Obviously, there's a lot of factors at play here, but just really interesting to hear about your experience leading that newsroom and the reporters that were reporting to you from the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I was in touch with one of the reporters. I'm not working for the national news. I'm specifically an investigative, but they borrowed a couple of our reporters to go in on the ground and cover. And there was definitely a mistrust of media. There was a mistrust of the public broadcaster. There was a sense that people were saying, well, you're not going to report what we're seeing fairly. And a lot of times when we asked, like, well, what is it what is it that we reported that you thought was unfair? It was clear that they hadn't watched the media. So there's something kind of a deeper mistrust. And what I've kind of found during these conversations is what seems to happen is someone will, read with a certain critical eye media, as they should, and they will find things that are wrong with the media. Maybe the headline was misleading. Maybe there was a factual error. And it leads to a mistrust or a building of mistrust. And they go and seek other sources. And here's where the point about not having diversity in the media comes out. They have a tendency to find sources of misinformation or disinformation, not news, sites that are purposely set up to mislead and are really there for the purpose of spreading misinformation. And those become the trusted source. So it goes back to what I was saying about a rich media environment has diversity. It has different credible sources that you can turn to. So if you feel that one, for whatever reason, has lost your trust because of a bad headline, a missed fact, you feel like there's a slant or a missing interview, that you could go to another source that would be just as credible, but you can have trust in. And instead, people are going to pop up misinformation sites, Facebook groups, and places where rumors are being spread or disinformation is being purposely spread.
Thank you for that. That's a complex issue, which we could do another entire episode, but really appreciate your insights there. I think going back to the question of like a local functioning press and being able to have a shared understanding right at a grassroots level. I'm wondering also what you think about for communities that are still fortunate enough to have a local press. What are the staffing levels and available jobs looking like at the moment? Is there enough of a newsroom to actually have deep coverage at all political levels? And in the absence of it, how are communities compensating or not?
Oh, is that for me?
Yes. Sorry.
Yeah. So
as a follow-up, yeah.
I'm good friends with a lot of startups, and I think it's a struggle because first of all, it's a struggle for funding. Not everybody is making it off subscription base, and actually few of them are. Few of them are making it off advertising. And so a lot are dependent right now on, donations, support from foundations. And it's a little bit shaky what they're able to cover because the money usually comes with some attachment to it, which doesn't mean that it comes with a spin or it comes with, somebody, usually they're pretty good, like keeping arm's length, but it does mean that there's some directive to it, like cover the environment or cover this issue, and you proceed to do that. So the choice is not necessarily being driven up from the community, if you know what I mean, or the community's needs. So there is that issue with it. And it's a struggle to balance both the daily news service that people need and the investigative, because they tend to be very small and they're not built up yet. There's a question of how they're going to make that jump. Are they going to be able to expand and take the place of what used to be there?
Thanks so much for that, Jessica. I'm really interested to hear your kind of insight into the same question as well.
I've been thinking about it since you asked that question, and we all trust our own community more than an outside one, right? When you look at what people trust the most right now is friends and family, followed by pretty much everyone else after. So for a long time, there was a practice in Canadian media and in international media was that if you didn't have a correspondent in a community, you parachuted someone in, right? And we've all seen that. So I'm the editor of The Walrus. For many, many years, it was common to send Toronto-based journalists all over the country and then have them do their report and then come back. What I see now is that that's not adequate. Communities know exactly when you're getting it right and when you're not, and they're going to take to Twitter and tell you about it. But I question increasingly the ethics of that. So whenever possible, we seek to find a local journalist. And if we really can't, we will get community readers. Especially when we do reporting on Indigenous communities. If it's by someone who's not from the nation or from the band, then even if it's an Indigenous writer, they will want to get input from local readers. So those are some things that we can do. But basically, the best thing we can do is actually privilege local journalism and understand the vital role that it has in the community.
Yes. Thanks so much for that. There's actually a really great short quote that I'll share from the new Shattered Mirror report. It says, "It cannot be done by a single person on the spur of inspiration. It has to be done day after day by people who monitor the deliberations of city council and the courts and the school boards, and who are able to command the confidence of the community they're covering, even when that community may be divided. It requires a collaboration of talents, from reporting skill to editorial judgment. However modest, it requires a newsroom." So I think that's a pretty powerful articulation of the need for it. So Katie, just to kind of switch a little bit over to the focus of the conversation, I'm just wondering your thoughts on what are the impacts of when much of our news landscape is functioning at a national level. I saw that, the report cites that when people are encouraged to think like locals or what they have in common, that kind of helps with, sort of a shared understanding on the ground, whereas sometimes national news can frame things through a partisan lens, which can contribute to polarization. I'm not necessarily saying that that happens all the time, but I thought that was a really interesting part of the report. So just wondering what you think.
Well, I echo what both Karen and Jessica said, and especially, I think around the local context, and this is more of a personal anecdote, but again, being from New Brunswick myself, my family's still there. Steve Murphy just recently retired, the anchor for CTV Atlantic, and he was a staple in, living rooms across the country, including, my dad, who watched every single night and still does. So I think that connection and trust cannot be overstated. And really, when you know your local journalists, you trust them. And so you're going to trust more what they say rather than, when you look at a national landscape, it might be a lot easier to not have that embedded trust. And especially, again, when your local community might not be experiencing issues in the same way. And I think that's really abundantly clear in the last 2 years, especially with various, whether it's COVID related things or otherwise, local communities were experiencing that very, very differently. And so when you have just a national landscape or a predominantly national landscape, or again, a lack of diversity in your local context, it makes it very challenging to square your personal and your community lived experience with what you're kind of reading and seeing. And I think in some ways that can spur some distrust, rightfully or wrongfully so, and it can spur some skepticism. I think one of the things that we really looked at in the report was, with the local journalism initiative, if it were to expand, it could actually support much more than just, paying the salary for a journalist to go into a newsroom. It could support training. It could support, relationship building with communities to perhaps find a sustainable funding source for that local journalist to be able to stay beyond their 1-year contract. So I think, promoting that piece is really interesting and important, and we look forward to frankly looking more into that. I think, to Karen's point as well, there's this innovative business model side to things as well. And one of the things that we've been clear about is business model neutrality in as many support programs as possible. So it shouldn't necessarily matter if you are a nonprofit or if you're, an issue-based kind of outfit that's starting up, focusing on the environment or focusing on tech. It really should just matter that you're abiding by journalistic standards and you're doing, you're doing your best to kind of fill a gap. So I think, all of those pieces are really interesting and live topics right now. But I think, boiling it back to that piece of trust, I think it's hard to not trust somebody that is literally broadcast into your living room every day.
I think that's really well said. And I'm really excited to actually switch soon to, that sustainability and innovation question as well. But first, Jessica, I'm hoping to ask you, just looking back and, with the full admission that hindsight is 2020, I'm wondering what you think the journalism industry and local news could have or should have done differently as the landscape started to change, as social media platforms began to arise and the like.
Yeah, so two things. I mean, one is I wish everyone had not given all their content away for free, because the outlets that are doing relatively well now, including the New York Times and a couple of other the biggest US outlets, are doing it through paywalls. So they've crawled back. There's only one outlet I know in Canada that never really abandoned its one. So we underestimated users' interest in paying for content that was valuable to them. The other thing, though, is that I feel like we all gave up on news and underestimated audiences' sophistication. Like in 2014 or later, there was this belief you have to be as fast as possible, you have to be as short as possible. And what we're seeing now is that that's just not true. Our average articles that are like 1,600 to 1,800 words, which would be quite a substantial news feature, are short now, and people just eat them up. So it's not whether something's bitty and distracting necessarily. It's, is it valuable to someone? And then they might pay for it.
Yeah, thank you for that. I was actually thinking about this earlier, and I was trying to see if I remembered correctly that, when social media and big platforms started to rise, that most newspapers were making content free. And so I wonder, as a result of that, cultural switch, do you think that that lineage of people being used to free journalism and potentially being more reticent to pay for it now as a result of that experience is still a large part of the problem?
I think, and this is something I pointed to in my story, is that there's two worlds developing. There's a significant percentage of people in this country, especially, that will never pay for content. They're not trained to, and they just don't want to. So they'll go wherever they can get free content, even if it's bad or full of mistakes and fake and stuff like that. Then there's the opposite end of the spectrum, which is the people that will pay for a subscription, tend to be more affluent, tend to be more urban, I think. So you don't want to have a country where there's two levels of information, and only the privileged people get the good stuff.
Yeah, thank you for that. And obviously we know that these are tough economic times, but when you actually look at what the prices of being able to access independent, objective journalism, it's actually quite low. It's around the price of a Starbucks coffee or something like that. So I think it's important for people to realize that there's these small investments have gigantic payoffs, not just for themselves personally, but for Canadian news in general. Karen, so I want to go back to what we were talking a little bit earlier about diversity in reporting and also the coverage in Indigenous communities. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your work, which I know everybody is really dying to hear more about, but also the necessity of local news as a mechanism for Indigenous representation and reporting of local issues. And really interested to hear about your work with Journalists for Human Rights as well.
Sure. Okay. So there's a lot there. Maybe I'll answer one of the questions, then if I have need of all the time, throw another one at me.
Okay.
I think that the best way to describe my experience going in and bringing news to an underserved community that had never had it before was really the first time I covered a federal election for APTN. And we made a decision that we weren't going to go with a bus, because the leaders' bus never stops in our communities. It just doesn't. And even the local MPs often don't go in. So there were 4 MPs running in the riding. I remember them all, but I won't shame them because it was a while ago. Maybe they've learned better. But
Hopefully.
There were 4 MPs running in the riding. And, I went to one and they said, "What's the topic?" And I said, "Land claims and bad housing." And they said, "We're not talking to you." So it's just that, not talking to you. Your people don't vote. It doesn't matter. We're not going to say anything where we could make a mistake. We're just, whatever they were thinking. They didn't share their thoughts with me, but it was clear that those potential votes in those communities don't matter. And, you're not going to get somebody to vote for you by not speaking to them. Another MP, I asked the remaining 3 MPs, "Are you going to visit the communities?" And none of them were. One of them told me she was afraid to go into the community. I have no idea what she even meant by that. And she was asking me if I could arrange it for her, which is not my job as a journalist. So that actually went into the story. And then of the remaining 2, one of them checked their pamphlet and realized that their pamphlet said that they were going to address treaty issues. And so they were very happy that they had something on Indigenous issues to speak about. And they made this big thing about, "We're going to address the treaties. We're going to fix all the treaties." And I pointed out that the people in that riding had never signed a land cessation treaty. And the main issue for them was settling the comprehensive land claim. So there was no treaty there. And what was he going to do about that? And he said, "Well, we'll fix all the treaties first, and then we'll get around to that." Which just sounds absolutely foolish. He did not know what he was talking about. And so in this sense, that kind of level of accountability to the communities where politicians had to, it was being exposed that they weren't visiting, that they knew nothing about them. I don't know if it really helped the vote that election, but it definitely made the MPs a little bit more embarrassed. And I think do a little bit more of their homework for future elections.
Thank you for that. That's actually very powerful and ultimately very unfortunate account of, how MPs were looking at communities, and we shouldn't fear one another. We should build bridges and speak to one another and learn about the issues that matter, which is, at the very core of what we do here at the Democratic Engagement Exchange. And I'm hoping to just ask a little bit more too, because I know you wear many hats, which is what makes you such an incredible journalist, but really interested to hear about your work with Journalists for Human Rights as well, please.
Oh yeah, Journalists for
Thank
Human
you.
Rights have been absolutely great. They go into First Nations communities and they do the same program that they've been doing in emerging democracies around the world, where they send expert trainers in to teach local people. And it's a lot of youth, but it's also, you will get adults who come out to do this too, how to report and how to write. And they'll do, sometimes their stories are picked up and published in Indigenous newspapers and media. And sometimes some of them have set up their own media that, it becomes more of a hobby media. Or in one case, I know they restarted a radio station that was sitting there closed, but nobody had really had the talent, the know-how to do the technical part of it. So this is like revived, I think, an interest in journalism, and we're seeing definitely more young Indigenous people go into journalism than before. Not hordes, but I mean, there used to be so few, and I would never get an application from anybody who had a journalism degree who's Indigenous. They've fallen into it, and over the past few years, I've seen people choosing to do that degree, which is wonderful. And I credit a lot of that to JHR's program.
Thank you for that. We'll share the link to JHR's program when we do our thank you as well. So I feel like that's a really nice piece of hope, I think, for this conversation, and a really nice segue to transition into some potential innovations and pathways that we can discuss with our audience. So Katie, I'm just wondering, what are some potential pathways that you're excited about in terms of local news and opportunities for democratic renewal?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one thing, and it's very specific actually, is, in 3 years ago, I guess, in the kind of major journalists package that was introduced by the federal government in 2018, there was a digital subscription tax credit. And I mentioned this because, as somebody who actually, as a user who tried to use it last year on my taxes, the 15% rate of it was not enough for me to frankly go through the trouble of figuring out how to use this tax credit. So I mentioned that because I think there's a real opportunity now that we actually have seen a number of great programs. Again, I mentioned the Local Journalism Initiative. I'm mentioning this digital service tax, or digital subscription tax credit rather. There's the labor tax credit as well. I think now that we've seen some programs in the field and starting to unfold, there's an opportunity for us to be able to analyze them, see if they're working, and see what we can do to actually augment them or make them better to incentivize journalism. So, I think to Jessica's point, some people, it's going to be harder for them to want to pay for journalism or to understand the importance of that. But if they get a 15% tax credit, for me personally, that's not going to make me add subscriptions to my own news diet. If it was something like 50%, then maybe that changes the game, right? So I think if we look to the bright spots that we're starting to see, whether that's policy or whether that's amazing new startup, innovative business models and organizations, and say, what can we learn from this? What can we do better? What can we, move forward and build on, and lessons learned to create new models? And what does that look like to solve the problem that we're trying to solve, which is more local journalism, or just more journalism broadly? So I think if we really tie interesting innovations we're seeing to the actual problem, then we can start to see, more solutions. And I will say, again, I think just pointing, a bright spot back to the Local Journalism Initiative, having been able to hire over, it's actually over 400, I said over 300 earlier, over 400 journalists just this year is a real bright spot. So what can we do to build on that and move forward?
I think that's really well said, Katie. And, I think like the sign of an excellent policy are, can people operate independently of it eventually? So I think that, that's a really important measure for us to take a look at, but certainly that is a bright spot. Jessica, really interested to hear your take as well. Just wondering what kind of innovations you've seen. We have seen some really exciting new presses emerging, like the Narwhal and a Local. And so I'm just wondering, what innovations or what kind of models seem to have potential in your view?
It's a really great time to start something, and I can think of 10 or 20 digital startups that are independent, that are operating in the country. They probably have revenues of 300,000 to 500,000, which is going to sound like a lot to you, but it's not actually to run a newsroom. What is quite difficult. So I think it's never been a better time to be a digital journalist if you're going to sort of start something. I think what's really hard is to scale your operation. So a lot of people don't last longer than 2 or 3 years because their original funding runs out, or they just, that getting from that point where you're 2 or 3 people to 10 people is huge. And so I was at the Walrus when we passed our 15th anniversary, which is what I would call the point where I suddenly realized it was going to be okay.
Congratulations,
so
by the way.
I've been in that mode for 3 or 4 years, and it makes a huge difference just in terms of, I remember the day that everyone got up-to-date computers so we could all run the same software at the same time, and you could almost hear cheers running in the newsroom because it was like we were going to make it. So I think it's good. I think that we need some support, and maybe Katie can speak to this, to encourage that innovation, because if you don't have the money, it's not that accessible to you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Katie, did you want to weigh in there a little bit? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think this is an exact question that we were grappling with in our research, which is, it's one thing to support existing organizations that are maybe, holding on by a lifeline. It's a total other thing to incentivize new organizations to fill these gaps. And so I think, an expanded local journalism model could actually have an innovation stream, right? It could have, it could take in, different funds and aggregate to be able to support the startup and the training and the skills development that it would need, that it would take to either scale up or start up in a new and interesting environment. And again, I think it could, there's a real opportunity broadly. Jessica, you mentioned 10 to 20 different organizations that are kind of in that space already, or that are coming into that space. Well, how do we take the information that they've learned and create in some ways a roadmap for new folks that might want to get into that space, and really help provide the tools so that the folks that do want to fill these news deserts or do want to start something new, they have the tools and they're not starting from scratch when there are lessons to be learned, but they're not necessarily totally collated right now. So I don't know, I think that's what excites me too. And we'll see, hopefully we're able to move forward on that.
And so Kara, I just wanted to ask you quickly as well, what kind of support ecosystem, I know we've talked about it a little bit here, but needs to be cultivated in order to battle against this decline in local news, like government, subscribers, foundations? Just wondering, if you can quickly weigh in there. And then I have one last question, kind of as a rapid round for all of you, and then we'll go to the audience questions.
Sure. So, I mean, I think, I said like diversity, you need something from enough sources. And this has always been the issue. Like back in the days was advertising, you didn't want one big advertiser, because if you reported something they didn't like, you wanted to be able to survive. So I think the base of subscription, foundations, advertising, and other sources. And I just want to say, I really liked what I heard about funding innovation. My one fear with the local initiative is that you get a different government in and maybe they cancel it. So this is money that was going to pay for journalists, and when it's gone, those journalists disappear. When you fund innovation so that people can learn about other business models and build their own, like get up on their own feet, if you will, then even if the program's canceled, you've invested in the business end of it and in finding a business solution. So I'll point out that there's a few crazy things that work in Indigenous country. People do chase the ace and they do bingo to support their local media.
Amazing.
And yeah,
awesome.
And it works. It works in these communities. So there are other things out there that are even, wild and crazy things that somehow work.
You know, I really appreciate that. And I think like obviously fundraising and events are a huge piece of this as well, and has been extra tricky in the pandemic. But again, I feel like that's, we could do a whole episode on that as well. So I want to do one rapid fire round and then turn it over to our audience who have been sending in some really thoughtful questions. So my question is, whose responsibility is it to save journalism? And what can our viewers here today do personally? Jessica?
First of all, it's the media's job, and I'm an editor, so I think about that all the time. And then government, and then the public.
Great answer. Thank you. Katie?
I mean, I think it's everyone's job. I think, we right now see the entire world fighting for democracy. So let's fight for democracy by all stepping up and saving journalism.
Thank you for saying that. That's so true. And Karen?
It's everybody benefits from journalism. It's everybody's job to save journalism.
Thank you for that. And so I think, that's really important because we have such an engaged and invested audience here that it's good to know that there's those call to actions that people can actually, activate following this call. That's always the intention. So I want to thank the audience for being so engaged throughout, and also for the questions that are coming in. So the first one is coming in from a dear friend of Katie and mine, Marlena. Thanks, Marlena, for being here. So Marlena is asking, how have these changes in the landscape of local news, how it's consumed, access, affordability, et cetera, changed who is consuming it? Jessica, I feel like you touched on that a little bit earlier. Would you like to take that one?
I want to make sure I understand the question. So you mean like the local journalism initiative?
Yeah, so sorry, I'll just read it again. So how have the changes in the landscape of local news, how it's consumed, how it's accessed, the affordability of it, the existence of it, et cetera, has it at all changed who is consuming it?
Well, so we had a JHR Indigenous fellow named Oscar Baker III. He is amazing. He was hired by the local journalism initiative and went to report for an East Coast paper on the Mi'kmaq community. And so for a year, Oscar filed 2 or 3 times a week stuff that was happening. And I would argue that that community was represented in the mainstream media, and they consumed it. I think that to me is the perfect circle of it all.
And we just hired him, by the way, BBC.
Oh.
Oh, really? Oh, look at that. That's excellent to hear.
He's quite the journalist, so you should follow him.
Okay,
well,
we will.
And to round the circle, I know Oscar because he was based in New Brunswick as well. So he and I have crossed paths personally.
Oscar's famous.
Excellent. So shout out to New Brunswick and to Oscar. That's amazing. I am going to follow him after this. So we have another question coming in from Ali. Ali, thank you for being here. I actually connected with Ali on Twitter yesterday and asked him actually to tune in and pose a question because I was, so interested in the work that he was doing and tweeting about. So it's really wonderful to see that come full circle. So his question is, even if local newspapers / news outlets were well funded, how would they compete against myriad social media accounts that have more engagement, like SixBuzz and Facebook groups? That's a really good and tough question. Who would like to take that one?
I mean, just shortly, it's really hard to compete against, I think SixBuzz is like, if I understand, it's a collection of viral videos. So it is kind of more entertainment. And yeah. I don't think you can compete against entertainment. And I think that's okay. News will always have like a smaller audience than movies, but it will have a loyal audience. And I think that's what's important.
Thank you for that. Does anyone else want to weigh in?
I'm sorry, but I'm struggling to think of a well-funded local journalism operation, and I can't.
I think we might have to plan some more bingo nights. And I think that's the thing too, is that we have to see this as our co-investment in having, a thriving local news environment. Like, I'll just share with everybody, I grew up in Bloris Village in High Park, and we had the Villager for so many years when I was growing up. And I remember that on our coffee table. And to my understanding, it's pivoted online to more part of Parkdale piece, but I do miss the Villager quite a bit. And I know that we all play a role in that. So we have, or Katie, sorry, I didn't go to you. Did you want to say anything about that at all?
I mean, again, I think I'll go back to my New Brunswick example. I mean, Jessica, theoretically, the Telegraph Journal is kind of a well-funded local paper, but they were just bought by the National Post. So theoretically, they're going to continue, the conventional wisdom in the community, I guess, is that they're going to continue to consolidate. But, I think those different groups, like the community, like News Chaser Facebook group or whatever, is actually a tremendous opportunity for local journalism, because they can use those spaces to support and build their networks and build their readership and listenership, whatever that may be. So I think, plugging into the interesting kind of, again, maybe not creating those viral videos, but plugging into those spaces is actually a real opportunity for audience growth.
Thank you for that. So we have one more question, also from Ali, and actually, I think it'd be really great if we allowed him the opportunity to pose it himself. Ali, would you like to do that? And Ashley, are we able to unmute him? I'll give it maybe 10 seconds to see if that's possible. If not, I will read it out.
I've just unmuted Ali.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Hello, everyone.
Thanks, Ali. Thanks for being here. I really appreciate you joining.
Thanks so much for letting me ask the question myself. So I think it was Karen mentioned earlier that people will read something on CBC or CTV or whatever, and then they'll read a headline, and the headline will kind of miss something or kind of not be as accurate as we wanted it to be. And then what happens is that they rightfully kind of scrutinize that and say, you know what, I don't trust this article. And I kind of wish that same critical eye was applied to the fake news that they would be reading. Because what I'm finding is that, sure, you're being critical with CBC, Globe, and all the kind of major news outlets. But then when you read, like something that you can't even source properly, or something without an author, or something that's essentially just a very long Facebook post, you're not applying that same sort of critical eye that you would with these other outlets. And so how does that, how do you now kind of compete with that? Because, like even if you are fact checking and are reporting well, it seems like you're still going to get that same sort of scrutiny from that crowd, right? So I don't know how to make it, how to reconcile that.
Karen, did you want to take that one?
I don't have an answer for it, but I guess I've been watching a lot of disinformation. It was part of the work that I was doing a little bit. I'm still attached to Ryerson University. And I was watching it through the pandemic. And what I can say is, like, I think it's a problem that we have to figure out how to solve. And I don't have an answer for it now. But when you look in at, sort of what's happening in Russia and the Ukraine right now, the Russian government, when they do disinformation, it's not necessarily to get anybody to believe anything. They want to flood with so much disinformation that you just don't know what to believe anymore. And we have people who are in a democracy where they have legitimate sources of news who are falling for disinformation without having that large state push to try to get them to do it. And so it's frightening. And as we lose media, I think that we get more and more people turning to these alternative sources. And I don't know what the answer is, but I agree that it's something that we need to start working on.
Thank you. So, I want to say thank you so much for all of, the time, the brilliance, the attention, everything today. I think it's been a really moving conversation and a call to action for all of us going forward, and something that we'll continue to talk about in the democracy dialogues and beyond. But before we say goodbye, I'd just like to turn things over to John Beebe, who is going to be talking and briefing all of you a little bit on upcoming electoral engagement that the exchange is doing. John?
Yes. Thank you very much, Victoria, and thank you, everybody, for being here with us. Thanks our amazing guests here for your leadership and your innovation. I mean, I think you're in a very challenging time, and your work is critical to our democracy. And Karen, I think, you said your story about your early work working in Indigenous communities and holding politicians to account. I just thought, to me, resonated and went back to the core of what democracy is about. And that's holding our elected leaders to account. And without vibrant, local news, we don't have that ability. And that story, of your intervention there and how it actually changed the behavior of those folks who are trying to seek to represent us, is a very granular and important story about how journalism and great journalists and people who are working locally can work to make democracy function effectively at the local level. And so that we can ensure that those folks who seek to represent us actually do, and that they can be held to account. So thank you, everybody, for that. We know that democracy is really built from the ground up. That's at the heart. And so I just want to encourage everybody here to check out, we have in Ontario, we have an election coming up in a few months in June. And we work with community partners across the province to ensure that those folks who often don't take part in elections are invited to do so. Because we know that without being invited, it's exactly what you spoke to, Karen, without that invitation to participate and that support in participating, they don't. And so we need to build a positive cycle. So please check us out. Visit our website for the latest information. I, of course, have to say our name, www.engagedemocracy.ca. Sign up for our newsletter if you're not already signed up. And you'll learn there. We're offering free trainings around the province, as well as resources for community leaders and local organizations to do that work of engaging their communities and working with people to make sure that they have a voice in the election. And again, thank everybody here for joining us and being with us, both as our guests and the people who joined us over this last week, and look forward to seeing you more and reading more of your amazing work. Thanks so much.